I'm Joan Sedita, founder of Keys to Literacy. This is a professional development recording of a presentation I did at the Ohio Literacy Academy 2020. Our topic today is literacy planning for grades 4 to 12, a model for schools and districts. We need to talk about literacy planning and think about it not so much as an event or something you do in a day or even a week. It's something that takes a long time if we're going to do it right. We also want to think about a literacy planning process as being more like a marathon than a sprint. The other thing I want us to keep in mind is that nobody likes change except a wet baby. And if we think about this, if we're doing a literacy plan for how we're going to make a middle school or a high school or even upper elementary grades improve the literacy achievement of students, it's going to involve some change. And so we want to make sure that as we develop our plan, we put things in place that are going to make the people who have to execute that change feel comfortable about it. Really good teachers working on their own can make some difference, right? We know that most teachers work really hard. They want to see their students learn, see their literacy skills improve. But oftentimes, if we're working on this as individuals, we don't get the benefit of a group collaborative effort. And that's where a literacy plan can come into place. It allows those teachers to work collaboratively for the same goals, knowing what those goals are, and that can make all the difference. And we also need to remember that the reason or the problem that students struggle with reading and writing is not their parents, it's not their teachers, and it's not even the students. The issue is that basically throughout our schools and our districts, we often have a Swiss cheese approach to literacy. What I mean by that is that we do some things really well, but then there's little holes, there's gaps. And that's the purpose of a literacy plan, to try to identify those holes in the Swiss cheese and start to figure out how we can plug them in. Let's talk a little bit about the goals of literacy planning. It ensures that you have a vertically aligned curriculum so that as students move from grade to grade, but then also from subject to subject, that you've got a consistent set of goals, curricula, and also instructional practices so that as the students move through those grades, they can make links in their learning. We also obviously want to make sure that our literacy plan is aligned to whatever our state literacy standards are. It also supports what's known as a model of tiered instruction, sometimes referred to as RTI or response to intervention, and sometimes referred to as MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. And we'll talk about that in a moment. It allows you to make sure that we are teaching both core instruction across all grades, but also consistency around the interventions that we use, as well as consistency around literacy assessments. The goal of an assessment model or plan is to provide different kinds of assessment, and that might include things such as screening, diagnostics, progress monitoring, maybe things, summative assessments like we get on high stakes state assessments, but all those kinds of assessments, and more importantly, the data that we get from these assessments. What we want to be able to do is have a model, a way that teachers can access that data. Because if we just do testing for testing's sake and we don't use the information we get from that to actually inform or drive our instructional decisions, then the assessments really are not that helpful. And so that's also part of the literacy planning process. I'm going to show you a graphic organizer that hits the different components that make up a literacy plan. This is a graphic organizer that we use in a lot of our Keys to Literacy professional development programs for comprehension and writing, vocabulary. But here I'm using it as a way for you to sort of see the big picture. What are the different elements or components that when you develop a literacy plan, what components do you want to address? Let's go through them each a little bit, and as we go through the rest of the workshop, I'll be addressing each of them in a little bit more depth. So the first is leadership, and part of that is developing a literacy planning team. These literacy plans can be done at an individual building level. So an elementary building could do this, middle school, high school, but it could also be across a district. And in that case, your district plan would reflect what you want to do and your goals and your action steps across multiple buildings. So the literacy planning team is essential, and we want that team to be representative of all the stakeholders. We'll talk about that a little bit more as well. But the idea is that we get this team together to initially develop the plan, but then year after year, we have additional literacy planning members. They might switch out from year to year. They keep guiding the plan and updating it. But when we look at leadership, we also are taking a look at what do we have in place? What background knowledge do key administrators who make decisions about curriculum and professional development assessments, what background knowledge do they have? Do we have a strong knowledge base among our principals and our district leadership? The second area has to do with what's called core instruction. And this is usually one of the biggest parts of your literacy plan. What you're trying to identify is what are we using to teach reading and writing and listening and speaking skills at each grade level? What are we using for that instruction that benefits all students? So in the early grades, it's what are we using to teach beginning reading skills? As you move up into the grades, it's what are we doing to teach content literacy, not just in English language arts class, but in subject areas such as math, history, that sort of thing. So taking a good hard look at the core literacy instruction that is in place and determining what are its strengths and what are some of the weaknesses. The third component in the literacy planning process has to also do with instruction, but this is intervention instruction. So again, what are we using for curricula, for materials, for training for teachers, for intervention? What are we using for those students that need either a little bit of supplemental support or maybe a serious degree of interventions? So that's the third component. The fourth, and I mentioned this already, is assessment. And part of the literacy planning process includes taking stock of what's already in place and looking at, are those assessments connected as students move from grade to grade? Do all of the folks who need to have access to that data have access to it? Do they all even know what assessments are in place? So that's another piece, as well as the data analysis. The fifth component to all this is professional development, because we know that the different folks who play a role in instruction, whether it's the teachers or maybe paraprofessionals, interventionists, administrators, you know, what kinds of professional development do they need in order to know how to teach either the core instruction or the interventions, or to know how to administer and interpret the data from assessments. So professional development is a big piece of this. And often what we find when we work with districts who do this literacy planning work with us is that, you know, when you ask what sort of PD has happened, you know, let's say in the last 5 years related to literacy, it's usually kind of a hodgepodge. And then the second piece to that is we ask, so have the results of that professional development, have they stayed on? Are teachers still using what they learned in that training? And very often the answer is not. And again, that's because a strong literacy plan isn't in place. And finally, the last component is to just take a look at the resources that are available to support literacy. And those resources might mean technology. What are the strengths and weaknesses around the technology that's available to support that? What about personnel? Do we have maybe too many reading specialists and not enough special ed teachers? Do we need more paraprofessionals? The resources can also be things just like time. You know, how can we look at our existing schedules and the way we schedule things during the day and for the week, and the way we schedule PLC time and time for teachers to meet? Where can we, you know, find some extra time, because that's a very valuable resource? And then, of course, funds. So are we using our funding sources properly? Are there maybe funds we haven't thought about? Perhaps there's literacy grants available from the state. Those are the components, and we're going to keep coming back to these, because as you think about creating a literacy plan, your plan wants to address every one of these components, identify the strengths and weaknesses that are happening now, and then looking at the weaknesses to identify a handful of goals with action steps that can be followed as you move across year to year. So let's talk a little bit more about how some of these components are related. And if you look at this slide, you'll see there's a visual that begins over on the right with assessment. And the idea is that we assess students using screening, in particular, maybe some diagnostics, to help inform our decisions about our instruction. And as you can see, the next part of the circle is instruction both for all students, core, that we talked about, and also for struggling students. So those assessments should help us make decisions about how we're going to teach the students. And part of that is setting some goals for that instruction. So what do we hope to achieve by a certain point in the school year? But then we have to kick back into assessment, and that's why this is sort of a spiraling process, because it's only through our assessment that we get to progress monitor and determine if the students are in fact learning the skills that we need them to learn. If they don't, we make adjustments to the instruction, set new goals, and the cycle repeats. You'll see that there are two pillars on either side of this. The first is leadership, and the second is professional development. And these things are components that are part of the literacy plan that if they're not in place, if they're not strong, then it's really hard to make the other components work. So let's also talk about how long this might take. I mentioned before that this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. This isn't something that a few people get together one day and sit around a table and write a plan, because if you want it to be actionable, first of all, you need to make sure that the stakeholders are going to have to execute the plan are part of the process. The other thing is if we really are basing it on taking a good hard look at what already exists, it takes time to gather that information. If you're just doing this on a building level, it might not take as long. If you're doing this across multiple buildings for a district literacy plan, it will take longer. But basically, I think you need to think about developing the plan, but more importantly, executing the plan, starting to act on the goals that you set. This could easily be up to a 3-year process. And all along the way, you want to keep looking at your literacy plan and updating it. Very first thing, you got to create a literacy planning team. And we'll talk a little bit more, have some suggestions for that. The second is you want to go through the self-assessment stage, right? So look at those components that we talked about earlier. Third, you want to identify the strengths and weaknesses. And then for each of the areas that we talked about, develop a couple of goals, anywhere from 1 to 3 or 4. Some of the areas around instruction might have more than others. A goal is more a broader statement, and I'll give you some examples of that and some tips for how to write them. But it's the action plans associated with each goal that really spell out what are you going to do to follow up on the goal. Part of that process also is to prioritize. So you might say, you know, among the 3 goals we have for literacy assessment, this one is going to be number 1. It's what we're going to focus on, you know, starting next month. And then maybe the 3rd goal is something that we'll get to that in about a year from now. And so you can't do it all at once. You know, we have to be realistic. And that's why this can take several years before we actually address all of the goals that we've put into our literacy plan. We've got a set of handouts for you with some templates and printables and things that will help you if you decide to follow the literacy planning process. Let's start at the end. And the very first handout I want you to take a look at is handout 1. And this handout basically is like a template that you could use so that at the end of the literacy planning process, after you've done your self-study and identified things, you could use this plan, this template, to actually write up the plan. Now, we provide it to you in a way that you can easily modify it, so you can change sections around. But if you have the handout in front of you, let's just walk through it so you can see what, in the end, the literacy plan will look like. At the very top on the first page, this is where you're going to list the members of the planning team so that everybody who looks at your plan has a sense of who participated. The next section is your vision statement. This is sort of broad. This is where you're going to answer a couple of questions. And those questions include things like, why does our district need or our building need an improvement plan? How is this plan going to connect to other district planning documents that we have? And you basically summarize this. Now, in a little bit, we're going to be talking about how one of the first steps in beginning this process is to write a making the case statement. And what that is, it's something that eventually becomes a part of the wording that you use in this vision statement. So the making the case is where you lay up front lay out up front, why do we need this literacy plan? What's going on with literacy in our building or in our district that causes us to decide we want to tackle this issue? And that ultimately does become part of your vision statement. The next thing in the template for writing the literacy plan is a series of sections, and they're all set up exactly the same. You basically take each of the components in the literacy planning process that I mentioned, and you, number one, summarize the current status as it exists. So for example, let's say it's the assessment component. You would describe what literacy assessments are in place, how do they differ grade to grade, how is the data being used. The next piece for each component is to summarize the strengths and weaknesses. So what did you identify, in this case as it relates to assessment, that is going well, things that really stand out as something we want to definitely keep doing. But it's also where you summarize where the holes are, what things do you want to tackle. And then finally, you list out what are the handful of goals for that component. So in this case, it would be what are your 1 to 4 goals as it relates to literacy planning. And as the report develops, you basically do what I just described for each of the components, and that pretty much fills up the body of the report. The next section, after you've summarized each component, laid out the goals, this is where you summarize and get into a little bit more detail the action steps for each goal. So for this part of the literacy plan, a goal is presented, and then a series of specific action steps. And what goes into the action steps? You decide what's a timeline for an action step. What are the specifics? Who's responsible for carrying out that action step? What resources do you need to follow that action step? And then finally, what measures will you use to determine if you are successful with it? And then the very last section is where you describe the expectations for building. If it's a district plan, it's what do we expect each building to be able to do to carry out this literacy plan. If it's a district-wide, that might vary from building to building. And then the other part of the ending piece of the literacy plan is what's your plan for sustainability and for distributing. So how are we going to get this plan out to all the stakeholders? How are we going to let everybody involved in the building or in the district know that this was a collaborative effort and we're all going to be working towards this over multiple years, as well as the sustainability? Because the literacy plan shouldn't be dependent on one key administrator. It shouldn't matter who comes and goes. The literacy plan is what kind of holds it all together over time. I just showed you kind of the end product, what the literacy plan looks like. How do we actually get there? So we have a document for you that is called, kind of a school or district literacy improvement plan. And basically it goes through each of the phases or the stages. And I sort of hinted at some of them already, but let's go through them a little bit more just to make sure we cover them. So the very first stage is the making the case, setting the context for why you need a plan, and starting to assemble all the team members. And we want to make sure that the team members that we have on the literacy plan are representative of all the stakeholders. We don't want to just, for example, have a few administrators driving this. We don't want to just pick the people who maybe are reading coaches or maybe are our literacy district coordinator. Yes, they know a lot about literacy, but it's general ed teachers, it's everybody else in the system that's going to have to execute this. So you want representatives. If this is a district team, you want representatives from different buildings. You want a combination of administrators, regular classroom teachers, subject area teachers. So have somebody who teaches science, somebody who teaches social studies. You might even want to think about having a parent representative or maybe even somebody from the school board. But the idea is the more inclusive you make this, the greater the chance that everybody will buy into the literacy plan because they know that somebody was there representing them. The second piece is where you look at the current state of literacy in your building or district. And you're going to be looking at it through the lens of the different components. The improvement goals part comes next. And then finally, as I said, the action steps. Now, if you have a literacy planning team, there are some times where they get together as a whole team. Obviously, at the beginning of the process, you want to make sure that everybody who's on the team has some shared knowledge about literacy. So that might be a place where you do some overview about what we know about teaching reading and writing. Again, sometimes when we do this work and we consult with districts and help them with this process, we might come in for a day and give some foundational training to everybody on the team. That kickoff meeting is also where you start assigning team members to committees. And those committees represent the different subtopics, the components of the literacy planning team. So you might have one group of members who are going to focus on gathering all the information about what's going on with assessments. You might have another one that's looking to see what's the current state of affairs for intervention. And that way you have a smaller group of people who are doing the work on one piece. But then eventually the literacy team comes back together. That's where they share what they've found, share their thoughts about what the strengths and weaknesses are, and then as a team come up with the goals and action steps. Now, before we jump back into the literacy planning process, what I want to do is spend a little bit of time, because my guess is that some of you who are watching this and participating, some of you may have deep literacy knowledge and some of you might not. So we're going to hit a couple of basic topics, and we're also going to talk a little bit more about that RTI and MTS. I want to begin by identifying what the National Reading Panel back in 2000 identified as the 5 components of reading. It's a nice simple schema that identifies the different kinds of skill areas that any successful reader, when we read, we often incorporate all 5 of these things at once. But when it comes to thinking about instruction, we can identify each one separately and talk about them, both in terms of core instruction and in terms of intervention. Now, the reason I keep holding my hand up is that a lot of folks, when this came out, thought it was a nice, simple way to remember the 5 components. So I'm going to identify them for you. Phonemic awareness is the first, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And again, remember, these all kind of work like strands in a rope together to allow us to be good quality readers. Now, I also want to remind us that we have to think about writing too, that writing has components to it as well. And I'll go through some of those in a minute. So now let's take a quick tour of those 5 components. And I'm going to just hit the highlights of what each of these components mean and why they're important, and why it's important to have them in place so that students can read in an effective way. So the very first is phonemic awareness, and I'm also going to combine it with phonics, the second component. And they really do work together. English is an alphabetic language, meaning we represent in print basically the sounds of our language. So we don't have a pictogram approach to our writing system the way, say, Chinese and a few other languages do. Basically, all of our words match to the sound. So if I say the word cat, I can hear the sounds in the word k, a, t, and there's a letter that represents each one of those sounds. And so because ours is in alphabetic language, the way that we teach beginning reading skills to students is to teach them how that system works. And that's basically teaching them phonics. Now, the precursor, before we even teach them how to map those sounds to those words and those letters, the precursor to all that is that we have to make sure that students can actually process those distinct sounds. And that's basically what phonemic awareness is. When we talk, we usually glom our sounds together. So if I say cat, it's just 3 sounds, but they all kind of come at you together. And that's fine for speaking and listening. But when it comes to reading, you have to be able to parse them out. So here's a very simple example of a phonemic awareness, a couple of tasks. If I say k, a, t, can you blend those together to make a word? Cat. The reverse would be, can you segment? So if I say the word pop, what are the sounds you hear? And so you segment them. P, ah. Now, a more advanced phonemic awareness task is either deleting a phoneme or a sound, or substituting. So if I say the word is cat, can you change the first sound and make it a p? What word do you get? And now you get pat. Or I could say the word is cat. Can you switch the last and the first sound, and what's the new word? And you get the word tack. So that's what phonemic awareness is, and it is a precursor. And for a lot of students who struggle as they move up through the elementary grades, it's because this fundamental component of reading instruction is not strong. Now, once we begin to bring letters into the equation, because all of that could be done just by listening, now is where you begin to move into phonics instruction, because you're basically teaching students what letter or letters represent each of those sounds in words that I hear. Now, on the simplest level, you would begin by teaching kids the simple letter sound association. So cat, the sound k only has one letter that's representing it. It's the letter C. A is one letter. It's the letter A. When you move into longer words, you get into more advanced phonics. So for example, if I say the word sheep, there are really three sounds we hear. Sh, E, P. But the first sound, sh, is represented by two letters, SH, and the second sound is represented by two letters. So one of the things about phonics, teaching phonics in the English alphabetic system, is that because we have such a complex spelling system, it's not that easy. But basically, the highlights of phonics are that we have 26 letters in our alphabet. That's all we have. And yet we have to represent 44 sounds. So the way we do that is sometimes we combine letters to represent those sounds. Now, again, what's complicated about English is that there are only 44 sounds, but there are over 200 ways to spell them. So oftentimes, folks who work with older students, they ask, well, what does all this have to do with students that are beyond the elementary grades? But the fact of the matter is that we all we tap into these phonics and phonemic awareness skills, but at an unconscious level when we see words we don't know. So I've just flashed up a word, and I'd like you to look at the word and read it out loud as fast as you can. The word is fantastic. Now, that's a word that's probably in our sight memories. We don't even have to sound it out. We know exactly what that word is. We can read it or, access it quickly. I'm going to flash another word now. And this time, I want you to pronounce it as fast as you can, and then we'll talk about what happens. So this word is pronounced onychophasia. Now, it probably took you a little bit longer to read this word because it's not a word you're familiar with. And also because it has a lot of really advanced phonics concepts in it. But whether you realized it or not, you actually applied those phonics concepts to figure it out, to sound it out. So for example, very often a CH in many words makes a ch sound. But in this word, knowing that it's a more advanced, it gets that hard k sound. The other thing is that G towards the end. Without even realizing it, you know that when a G is followed by an A, it's going to have a J sound instead of a G sound. So those are just a few examples. Let's try one more. I'll flash this one up. Try to read it. This word is callipygian. And again, it has a lot of advanced phonics concepts, and you weren't able to instantly read it because it's not necessarily part of your sight vocabulary. So let's now move on to fluency, which is really kind of the glue that connects these phonics or decoding skills to the part of meaning that we really, what it's all about, and that's making meaning. So when we're fluent, it's not that different being fluent in reading to being fluent in anything else that we do. I have a little picture here of somebody playing golf, and it's very similar. The way we get better at playing golf or trying a new software program or knitting, playing an instrument, the way we get better is by practice, right? And we want that, and we need that practice to be guided, meaning we need somebody to give us feedback about whether we're doing it wrong and give us corrections. And that's all that reading fluency is. The way you develop fluency, which means you're at a point where you can automatically, accurately, fairly quickly be able to read the words on a page. And that's what all good readers are able to do. But in order to get there, young children have to kind of practice. They have to learn those phonics skills, and then they have to practice reading over and over and over again. Many times, students who are a little bit older, who still struggle with reading, you can trace it back to the fact that they're just not fluent. And because of that, when they're reading words on the page, they have to put so much attention into making sense of what they're reading that there's no attention left to be able to focus on making meaning. Comprehension basically has several pieces to it. One is definitely vocabulary. If we don't know the meaning of enough words when we're reading, it's going to affect our comprehension. So that's a big piece of it. But there are some other components. Another is background knowledge. If I'm reading about, let's say The Old Man and the Sea by Hemingway, that novel, and, it takes place on the ocean, about boats and about fishing, but I live in the middle of the country and I've never seen the ocean, I've never maybe been on a boat. It's much harder to connect to the story than if you have that background knowledge. So that plays a big role. That's a role that content teachers can play. Another area is text structure. So for example, when we read narrative, and we've learned either because we've been taught or we've sort of figured this out on our own, we know that narrative tends to have a setting and characters, and it has maybe a theme. Or informational text, that tends to be chunked into topics and subtopics, and there's headings that give us clues to making meaning. But a lot of our students are completely unaware of text structure and the clues that it could give. So if you're going to be teaching comprehension, you'd want to hit vocabulary, text structures, make sure they're developing background knowledge. And then another really important one is strategies. So do students have strategies and awareness, or it's called metacognition, sort of thinking about thinking, to determine, oh my gosh, I'm reading, I don't get this, but then more importantly, have a fix-up strategy. So this could include things like taking notes and generating summaries of things and creating questions about what we're reading. So that was basically the fastest tour you're ever going to get of the 5 components of reading. It's important when we talk about the assessment part of literacy planning and instructional part of literacy planning, because as you address those components, you want to be thinking about all 5 of those components at once. Now what I'm going to do is do something similar, but this time in the area of writing. So the slide that you see here is something that I call the writing rope. It's a nod towards a reading rope, it's a model that Hollis Scarborough generated quite a few years back. But it basically identifies the different components to writing. And if we're going to look at how we teach writing in our schools, we want to be looking at multiple components. So just like with reading, it's not only how do we teach vocabulary, but it's also comprehension and some of the phonics skills. With writing, we want to hit all of these as well. So let's just walk through them quickly. The first is critical thinking. And these are the kinds of writing tasks that are used when students are writing about what they're learning. It's very similar to the kind of task we might get on a high-stakes state test, where the students are maybe given a few sources, they have to read, maybe even a video, watch the video. They're given a prompt. They have to know and have the skills to search for the appropriate information or evidence in the sources, and then write the prompt. To me, this involves a lot of critical thinking. It's also an area that any content teacher can play a role in, because whatever your task we might get on a high-stakes state test, where the students are maybe given a few sources, they have to read, maybe even a video, watch the video. They're given a prompt. They have to know and have the skills to search for the appropriate information or evidence in the sources, and then write the prompt. To me, this involves a lot of critical thinking. It's also an area that any content teacher can play a role in, because whatever you're teaching, maybe it's social studies and the students are learning about Egypt, and whatever materials you're having them read, you can have them, you can create a writing prompt that's similar to what they're going to get on a high-stakes test. Have them practice gathering information about your content to write a response. And in that sense, you're sort of killing 2 birds with 1 stone. You're teaching them writing skills, and at at the same time they're learning your content. Also, part of critical thinking is where we address things like the writing process. And what is that? Every one of us, when we write, doesn't matter what we write, we always do a little bit of thinking first, then we do a little bit of planning, then we do some writing, and then we do some revising. So all that goes under critical thinking. Another area component of writing is what's called syntax or sentence. And you may think that this is something that you only really focus on this in the early grades as kids are learning to write basic sentences, but it actually affects students right on up through high school. Their ability to have a sense of the way English grammar works, to be able to read and also write more complex, longer sentences. The third area is text structure, and I mentioned a little bit about this before, but this is teaching students how, when they write, that if they're writing a narrative or a story, the structure is going to be different than how they write an informational piece, and that might be different than the way they write an opinion or an argument. This is where we also think about things like transition words that help make clues. So however, therefore, first, next, last. But text structure is something that we need to explicitly teach kids. Now, so far I've hit 3 of these components. The first one and the third one, I think, are the ones that content teachers, so teachers of science, history, math, art, music, these are the areas that they're most likely to be able to integrate into their instruction. The syntax piece usually is something that English teachers or ELA teachers address. Writing craft, this is another one that usually happens more in the ELA class. And this includes things like teaching kids how to be careful about their word choice, depending on, who their audience is, what the purpose of the writing is. It's also where you teach literary devices. So, things like alliteration or how to use dialogue. And then finally, the last one, transcription skills. This really actually has a lot to do with how we can, it's important for kids being fluent writers. And so it has to do with things like spelling and handwriting and keyboarding. If kids aren't automatic with these transcription skills, it's going to get in the way of their writing. So we just completed a review of the 5 components of reading and also the components that make up good writing. And all of these have implications for instruction. With this next slide, I've got a chart here where we've got a number of the components of reading and writing that I mentioned in the left column. And then across we have kindergarten 1, 2, 3, and 4 to 12. And I've just laid out for you so you can sort of see that when it comes to beginning reading instruction, you'll see that basic phonemic awareness tasks are going to focus in K1. And after that point, unless kids really struggle, you don't need to be really teaching that in upper grades. Advanced phonemic awareness, that sort of substituting and reversing, that will happen, starting at the end of grade 1, maybe go into 2 and 3. But again, for students that don't struggle, once they're in 4th grade, you're not really going to be teaching phonemic awareness in any way. Phonics, same thing with that. Early phonics, the really basics, that's going to happen during kindergarten and 1st grade. And then as students move into 2nd and 3rd, and maybe a little bit into the 4th, they're going to learn the more advanced phonics concepts. But at that point, beyond grade 4, the kind of phonics that they're going to need is really more about what we call morphology or vocabulary. And that's where you're teaching students word parts, so roots and suffixes and prefixes. Text fluency, that practice, that reading a lot of text to get more accurate and more quick and also have some prosody, sort of up and down and inflection when we read. That really begins midway in grade 1 when students are able to read sentences, and that can continue on up. So even on into 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, even as adults, we're growing our fluency by reading a lot. Now let's look at a couple of areas that spread across a number of grades. At the top, we have oral language. This is important for young children before they're able to really read well, because the way they're going to grow their vocabularies and be exposed to background knowledge is by listening to their teachers and their parents talk and doing read aloud. So that's going to start and keep on going right through 3rd grade. You'll also notice that vocabulary, comprehension, and writing begins and goes across all grades. Obviously, what we teach at each grade level for these is going to vary, but it's something that needs to be part of the curricula across every single grade level. Now, I added a little visual here just to hit the issue of what about older struggling readers. And there may be lots of reasons why they struggle with their reading. It could be a lack of vocabulary. It could be lack of background knowledge, comprehension issues, but it also could be that some of those fundamental skills that usually we don't need to keep teaching beyond grade 3, they might be missing. And so part of your intervention, and this is what assessment will give you. Assessment information will help you figure out why an older student is struggling, and then that will end up informing whether you need to go back and actually, as an intervention, address some of those earlier skills. This next slide, I think, is really important. It's called the simple view of reading. It's been around since the 1980s. But it's a good way to understand how those components in reading that have to do with reading the words on the page, often called decoding, how they connect to the components that have to do more with making meaning. And you'll see that in this visual, I've got both of them there, and I've overlaid the 5 components of reading so you can see where they connect. Now, what's really important about the simple view is that you keep in mind that it's a little bit like a multiplication problem versus an addition. What do I mean by that? Well, if it was an addition problem, if students had good decoding skills, could sound out words, but couldn't make meaning, the language, they didn't have enough vocabulary, even though they had some skills, if they don't have some on this side, the reading is going to be effective. So it's not like 1 plus 0 still gives you 1. On the opposite end, if kids maybe can't decode, but they have good comprehension. So if somebody were to read aloud, they'd be fine, but they can't read. Again, just because we got 1, we're adding it to 0, it doesn't give us something. The ideal is 1 plus 1 is 2. So the reason we say this is like a multiplication task is that if you have 0 on either side, you're still going to end up with 0. So 1 times 0 is 0. 1 times 0 is 0. And that's the point, that students need to have well-developed skills on both sides of the simple view. Now, let's also talk a little bit about when kids who struggle, where they might fall if we were to do a chart such as the one you see here. So this is connected to the simple view. On the horizontal, we've got that word reading, and on one end, we've got kids who are really good at it, and on the other end, we've got poor word reading. We also vertically have that language comprehension. On one end, really good comprehension, on the other, weak. So if we were to think about good readers, grade level readers, they would fall in that upper right quadrant because they have both good comprehension and good language comprehension and good word decoding skills. All of the other students who struggle, however, might fall into some of the other quadrants. Most of them, especially as they get older, are going to fall in the bottom left. So poor or weak readers are probably going to have problems in both sides of the equation. There are some unique situations though. So for example, dyslexic readers, where it's a neurobiological disability, and part of what's affected is their ability to learn those basic decoding skills. So especially when they're in elementary grades, they may fall up in the upper left corner because they have good comprehension, but weak decoding. In the opposite, on the bottom right, this is where maybe some English language learners might fall. These are students who can decode words fine. They read them out loud and you think they're reading and understanding, but they don't have any comprehension. Now, what's really important to keep in mind is that for those dyslexic readers, if we don't start to address their needs and give them interventions to fix up those word reading skills, eventually they're going to slide into that category where now they have problems across the board as they move into upper grades. So that's kind of a review about the background knowledge, and this is important for literacy planning because if you don't understand these fundamental components and how they affect students and why some students struggle to read, it's not going to be as easy to follow the literacy planning process. The last thing we're going to do before we get back to some literacy planning details is we're going to revisit again what I mentioned as RTI, response to intervention, or MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. Because if your school or district is trying to adopt one of these models, the literacy planning process is really going to be helpful. So what are both of these? They are both school-wide instructional frameworks for literacy instruction. They both include universal literacy screening at the core. So at the start of every year, all students, regardless of whether they struggle or not, do some basic screening. Doesn't take a lot of time. It's not something that gives you a lot of details. It's kind of like taking the temperature of every student in your class just to see, do they have a fever? And what that represents is, are they on grade level or are they behind? So they all have a literacy screening. They all involve multiple tiers of instruction, and I'll go over those in a moment with you. And they all use assessment data to inform those instructional decisions. Let's talk a little bit more about models of tiered instruction. Let's start from the left side of the slide. We've got a bunch of students. So let's just say these represent all the 6th graders in our school, or maybe all the 9th graders in our high school, or maybe all the 4th graders. Ultimately, we want them all to hit their grade level benchmarks for reading and writing skills. But we know that among any group of students, there are going to be some who are able to hit that, most of them we hope, we're going to be able to hit those benchmarks, learn what they need just through the good quality literacy instruction we provide in the regular classroom. There are going to be some students, however, who that's not enough, that they might need a little bit of supplemental support. And maybe that support is short term. That's represented by the yellow band. So these are students that in addition to whatever they get in the regular classroom, we might want to give them some extra support. Sometimes it could be very short-lived. So there was a student I worked with who had some problems in 3rd grade with some of those basic phonics skills, really high language and vocabulary comprehension skills. So basically just 3 or 4 weeks, 2 or 3 times a day with some intense phonics instruction, filled in the hole. Student was able to move on and never needed any more supplemental. So that's kind of an extreme example of short-lived, but that's what we mean. It's supplemental. There then is a smaller category of students who that extra supplemental support might not be enough, and that's where we need to get into some pretty heavy-duty interventions. And by the way, in terms of how does this overlap with when students might or might not be eligible for an ed plan or special ed services. Somewhere along that process, as those students move into tier 2 and maybe tier 3, that helps you identify that it's time to do some diagnostics and determine if there is some sort of disability that warrants special education services. So again, this has implications for the literacy planning. One of the components is to look at what are you using for good core instruction in the regular ed classroom. And again, this could mean what are we using to teach beginning reading in kindergarten and 1st grade? It could mean what are we using to teach comprehension and vocabulary and writing in all subject areas in the upper grades. So you want to make sure that this instruction is quality, that it's evidence and research based, that the teachers have been trained to teach it properly. Our goal ultimately would be for all students that this should be enough, but we know there are always going to be a certain percentage that need more. And so for your literacy planning, the subcommittee and the group that looks at what's being used currently for interventions for struggling kids across the grade levels, that's where you really want to pay close attention. Do we have intervention programs? Do we have teachers that have been taught to use them with fidelity? Are the interventions that we're using, are they covering all the different areas that students might need? So for example, I've seen schools that maybe have a lot of intervention programs for vocabulary and comprehension, but hardly anything for phonics, or vice versa. They have 2 or 3 different programs that they use for phonics instruction, but not much for supplemental vocabulary. I want you to also think about with your literacy planning process, well, many schools tackle this because they're concerned that students' literacy skills, achievement skills are very low. And of course, we worry the most about our struggling students. But we also, in this literacy planning, want to be thinking about how do we set some improvement goals that are also going to help the students who are at grade level and maybe even beyond. So again, with this slide, you can see our goal is to take that range of skills and move everybody up a notch. Let's talk a little bit more about how this works in grades 4 to 12. So we mentioned before that some of the beginning reading skills like phonemic awareness, phonics, some of the starts to fluency really happen during the early elementary grades. And for most students who don't struggle, once they hit grades 4, 5, and above, really what constitutes core literacy instruction is making sure we're growing their vocabulary, that every teacher is teaching academic vocabulary all the time. Making sure we teach kids comprehension strategies and how to use them as they apply to certain disciplines. You know, how do you write a summary of history versus science? Building that background knowledge, because that's so essential. Also showing kids how do you set goals if you're going to read in science or write in math. And then finally, how to make that reading and writing and study connection. So these are skills that often when I show this slide to teachers in middle or high school and I say, is there anything on this slide that you feel isn't something you could or should be doing? Everybody always agrees, yes, they can. So again, we're not asking ninth grade math teachers to teach phonics, but these content literacy areas, we are saying that everybody can play a role. Now, we did say though, for students who struggle, if they are in grades 4 to 12 and they need intervention instruction that's beyond the core, then we may have to go back in and fill some of the holes in the phonics skills and even some of the more basic vocabulary and writing. Let's talk about what do we know about the characteristics of effective intervention. And this is important. It's why the reason we're going over this is that for your literacy planning process, when you take a look at what's happening for intervention, for students, you want to be keeping this in mind. So a really quality intervention is something that's almost always going to increase the intensity of the instruction. It's going to, it's more intense because we're going to have kids working in smaller groups. We're going to spend more time, and the reason we need that time is we're going to provide many more opportunities for practice and reteaching. And that intervention instruction has to be differentiated and focused carefully to meet the specific needs of the students who are receiving the intervention. So one student might need a certain kind of intervention that maybe focuses more on those decoding skills. Another might need an intervention that focuses more on vocabulary. Let's now jump back by going back to our literacy planning process. And I'm showing once again the graphic organizer of the components to literacy planning. Of course, the leadership and literacy planning team, core instruction, intervention instruction, literacy assessments, literacy professional development, and then finally resources to support the plan. So what I'm going to do now is walk you through some additional literacy planning documents that we've provided in the handout for you. The very first one is making the case. I mentioned earlier that this is something that really kicks off the whole planning process. It's something that a couple of key administrators who decided to tackle a literacy plan, you would generate your making the case statement, and use that as a tool to start to let folks in the community know that you're going to do a literacy plan and to also start to encourage people to be members on the team. You can make it as short or as long as you need. If it's just building level, it might only be a page long. If it's district, it could be multiple pages. The examples that we give you have short ones. So the very first one, example 1, is basically just 4 paragraphs long, and it in some sort of broad strokes kind of describes what's going on with literacy in the district, what are some of the issues, and makes the case for why a literacy plan is helpful. Some of the other examples that you'll see are much longer, and they include actual data. So some of them bring in some of the assessment scores across the grades and unpack that data. But it's where you're trying to make the case for why we even need to do this. eventually, I mentioned, this will become the foundation of your vision statement that will kick off your literacy plan. Ultimately, you want to be asking the questions and writing these up in a vision statement that follow. So what would, if this literacy plan worked and we could really improve and be successful with this, what would the students be doing in that scenario? What would the teachers be doing? What would the environment be like? And how would school leadership support all of that? And that helps drive your vision statement. All right, so that's the first part. And also part of that is getting that literacy team together. Now, the second phase is taking a look at the current state of literacy. So after you've assembled your team, you need to build their background knowledge, and then you need to give them some tools to start actually looking at what's happening in the buildings around each of the components. There are some tools that we've provided. I'll highlight a few of those in a minute. But basically, at this point, you're trying to get the members of the team to get answers to questions. Now, one of the documents we have given you, document 4, we've created a set of questions to help drive this process. So for every one of the components in the literacy planning process, we have a series of questions. Some are related more to district level and some to building level. So if I'm a literacy planning team member and I'm on the group that's gathering data about what's happening right now around core instruction in a particular building, these questions will help me find the answers. And then we need to begin collecting the information. The literacy team members can also ask other folks who aren't on the team to help with this. So you might go back to buildings and ask other teachers or other administrators. And you're basically collecting data about every one of the components. Now, on this slide, I have a URL here, a link to, on my Keys to Literacy website, we have actually a whole collection of free resources related to literacy. But one of the sections has templates and printables for different different literacy areas like comprehension, vocabulary, writing. But I have one specifically for literacy planning. And if you go there, you'll be able to download the documents that I'm sharing here, but also some gathering tools. So you could use the ones that we provide, or you could just create them yourselves. It really doesn't have to be more than, maybe just a survey or some charts where you capture the data. And what are we looking at? We want to look at what's being used for core Tier 1 instruction in grades K to 5. That would look a little differently than the way it would look in 6 to 12, which is going to have more of a focus on content. You want to have a data collection tool that helps you pull information about what's happening for intervention instruction. What programs are being used? What time of the day is it being used? Definitely, you want to collect information about assessments, and the printable that we make available to you allows you, it's a chart that allows you to look at all the components of reading and writing and ask yourself, do we have an assessment for this? Is it a screening? Is it a diagnostic? Is it summative? A way to collect what professional development has happened in the last 5 years. Is it still ongoing? And then finally, a way to gather resources about both funding and personnel and time, and what do we know about the resources that we can put towards literacy planning. The third step, and I've actually broken this into 3A and 3B, this is the goal part. So one of the handouts I have for you, handout 5, is a guideline for how do you develop goals. And again, you're going to do this for each one of the components. So you're going to have goals for core instruction, goals for intervention, goals for assessment, etc. Basically, you want to develop a set of goals that are easy for everybody to follow. You want to keep it narrow. You don't want to come up with 15 goals because you'll never get to them. And so you also want to start to prioritize. And I think the best way for me to give you a sense of what a goal statement looks like is to just share a few of them with you. These are on your handout, but I'll read a few of them out. So one of the goals is the district will identify, purchase, and support the administration of appropriate literacy screening assessments for all students in grades K to 12. And we're going to start that at the beginning of the following school year. Another goal statement. the district will investigate and choose a core writing program or model for use in grades K to 5. A third example, by the end of May, the district will establish common content literacy instruction expectations for science, social studies, math, and allied arts teachers in grades 9 to 12. I'll give you one last one. The district will develop a 3-year professional development plan for providing literacy instruction in vocabulary and comprehension. So those are some examples of goal statements. But now let's talk about how we develop action steps, because that's really ultimately where the rubber meets the road, right? It gives you guidance about how you're going to make the steps you're going to take to actually meet these goals. So for this, we can look at 3B, action steps. And I have another handout for you, handout 6, which gives you some guidance about how to craft action steps for each goal and several examples. I'm going to just go through one with you. By May 2014, the middle school will be ready to implement a reading progress monitoring tool to struggling readers in grades 6 to 8. So that's the overarching goal statement. But when you look at the action steps, there are 3 of them. So the first action step is we're going to research available progress monitoring assessments. So obviously this district didn't even know what was out there. So their first step is let's just find out what tools are available. And you can see the action step then plays out with a timeline. So they have dates, a person responsible. So the Literacy Assessment Committee is going to follow through on this. Some of the specifics. One of the things they're going to do is communicate with 3 other districts to see what they're using. They're going to collect sample assessments, and so on and so forth. So what are the resources needed? They need time to actually do this research. And then their measure of success, they're going to actually write up minutes from their committee discussions. The second action step was we're going to decide which tool to use district-wide, and we're actually going to purchase it. And then again, you can see the specifics related to the action step. So in this third stage of the literacy planning process, you're identifying your goals based on the strengths and weaknesses, and then you're coming up with some very specific actionable plans. The very last part, the fourth part, is the writing of the plan. So this is where, and it doesn't take the whole committee to have to write. You don't have to write by, groups of 12 people. You can identify a few key people who will actually write up. They summarize the findings from the different committees, they gather up the goals and action steps, and they go back to using that template to write the literacy plan. It's the handout that I started with at the very beginning of this workshop. And don't forget to include in that the plan for implementing it and long-term sustainability. So I can give you an example from a district that I recently did this work with. And one of the things they decided, they finished the plan up in June, and they felt like they wanted to kick off the school year by making the plan, announcing it to everybody. And at first they just said, well, what we'll do is at the start, the day before school, we have all the faculty together from the whole district, large number. That's when we'll roll it out. We'll have the superintendent read it out. Everybody will pass out copies, and that'll be great. But then the more they thought about it, they realized that, folks might have a lot of questions about this, or sometimes when you do something in a large group like that, it isn't as effective. So one of the last tasks that the literacy planning did was to come up with a different way to do this. And in the end, what this group decided to do was, at the end of the large all-faculty meeting, they broke out like 90 minutes earlier and assigned the teachers across different grade levels. So it wasn't even building by building. They just mixed them all in together. They broke them into groups of 30. And then each group of 30 had one member from the literacy planning team assigned to them. And it was within that smaller group that the literacy plan was explained to the 30 people. And this allowed the opportunity for questions and answers. And it also allowed the opportunity for people to see that the members of the team were just as involved, that this wasn't just something that the superintendent created on his or her own and kind of forced upon everybody. It really was a collaborative effort. I'm going to end with you on just a couple of tidbits about assessment as it relates to grades 4 to 12, because the title of this workshop was Literacy Planning 4 to 12. And a lot of what we've talked about will help you unpack what I'm about to share. But basically, if you're thinking about literacy planning for early grades, you want to be thinking about all those 5 components of reading. But if we're thinking about in upper grades, we don't necessarily have to assess every component. We would only do that for the kids who struggle. So let's just hit a couple mountaintops. Let's begin by just identifying the difference between kinds of assessments. There are assessments that are used for screening. They're also sometimes called benchmark. And it's something you do that doesn't necessarily take a lot of time, but it's a way to just, as a first pass, determine who's on grade level with a skill and who's not. The second kind of assessment is diagnostic, and this does take longer, and you don't do it with every student. You only use these kinds of assessments with the students who are struggling, who are not benchmarking. And what the diagnostic tests do is they allow you to go in deeper and diagnose what's causing the problem. And that is important because if you don't know what the problem is, then you can't assign the correct intervention. And again, we want to remember that there isn't one single intervention that works for everybody who's struggling. You might have to differentiate. The third type of assessment is progress monitoring. It's sometimes called formative assessment. And this is something you do during the school year to just measure, is what we're using to teach literacy working, both for general ed kids, but also is the intervention that we're using. The fourth and final kind is described as summative or sometimes outcome. This tends to be, something like the high stakes end of year testing that we do. That is, in many respects, it's giving you individual data about kids, but its goal really is to provide some data for kind of accountability and research purposes, to say, is the curriculum or the approaches that we're using in this building, are they working? With this next visual, I want to walk you through, if you are in a position to be developing an assessment model for upper grades, this model will help you think that through. So we start at the very top, measuring all the students. So let's say, again, it's 100 sixth graders or 100 ninth graders. We do some sort of screen, and that's up at the top. And we want the screen to be quick and fast. And usually in these grades, since the ultimate goal of reading is to understand, something that's going to measure whether kids can understand something if they read it at grade level. It could be a formal norm reference assessment. It could be something a little less formal, but we basically want to see what students, when they read, can understand grade level. Now, hopefully, the great majority of our students will do fine with them, and we can just keep them on their way, make sure we do good literacy instruction across all subject areas throughout the school year. Those students don't have to be tested again. Once is enough. We know they're doing fine. For the students that are not, however, they have a fever, they're not able to read and understand grade level material, we're now going to go to the second step in this assessment process. And the very next thing that we want to assess is their fluency, because fluency is highly correlated with comprehension. If students are fluent readers, it really supports their comprehension. If students are disfluent, meaning they don't have enough skills, odds are it's going to affect their comprehension. So that's why it's the very next thing we want to look at. Now, basically, fluency, an easy way to measure it is using something called words correct per minute. So you have students read a passage for a minute at grade level. You time them, you also check their accuracy, and you arrive at a score. You usually do that 3 times, 3 passages, and you take the average. And what that lets you know is if the student is fluent or not. If you're using a formal assessment for this purpose, the assessments usually come with norms. If not, there are national norms. And what these norms show you is what is the sort of average or 50th percentile words correct per minute for a particular grade level. And so by doing this fluency, getting a CPM for a student, you can look at the norms and determine, are they fluent or not? If they are fluent, but they're still having trouble understanding what they read, then you know that the problem has more to do with their comprehension and vocabulary. And so you certainly want to make sure they get good instruction in the core, but if you were to do an intervention for these students, that's what it would focus on. For the students that don't do well with the fluency, now you need to figure out why that is the problem. So we might at that point then go down to stage 3 and give some sort of a phonics assessment. It could be formal, it could be informal, but what we're trying to determine is the reason that the student can't accurately and quickly read words on a page. Is it because they don't even have the phonics skills, so they come to a word and they don't know what to do with it? Or do they have the phonics skills in place, they just need more practice reading to get more fluent? So that's why you do a phonics assessment. For the students that had problems understanding, had problems with fluency, but were fine with their phonics, your intervention would focus on some fluency instruction and practice, as well as comprehension and vocabulary. For the students that had the problems with the understanding, the fluency, and phonics issues, then your intervention is going to need to hit all of these components. For those students who get into middle school and definitely by high school who are still having problems with phonics and basic fluency, odds are they may already be on an education plan, and we just need to make sure we're giving them enough support. If you'd like some more information about this model, I've written a book chapter, and it's a copy of it is available for free at my website, and I've shared the URL in case you want to download that. Just a couple things to think about for your literacy planning around assessments. I call them literacy assessment pitfalls. You want to make sure that when you do bring assessments in, that you've provided enough professional development to the teachers and educators who are going to be giving the assessments, and more importantly, using the data. You want to provide enough resources and adequate time to give the assessments. Plan a sufficient personnel to do it. You don't want to, for example, if there's only one reading coach or reading specialist in the building, put it all on that person to do that. Many of these assessments you give can easily be given by a few other folks in the building who are trained to use it. And then more importantly, don't let the data sit there. Plan to act on the data. So I do want to say a few more words about professional development, which is one of the components in the literacy plan. And I actually have some quotes, so you could read along with me if you have the slide there. Without appropriate and ongoing professional development, instructional innovations are unlikely to be sustained or even initially implemented effectively. This comes from a research report titled Reading Next that came out kind of identifying what are the things we need to do to improve the reading skills of students in grades 4 and up. Another resource, it's very similar. It's called Improving Literacy Instruction in Middle and High Schools, a Guide for Principals. Professional development to support more effective reading instruction should be an integral part of a school's overall PD plan. And the principal needs to ensure that it fits well with other school priorities. So the message with both of these is don't forget the professional development. If we're going to expect teachers to make changes, remember the first slide I had at the start, the baby, no one likes change except a wet baby. We do want teachers to participate and make our literacy plans actually happen. We've got to recognize their needs, and one of them is to provide them with the professional development that they need. I'm going to end with this slide just to give you some information about how you can contact me and also how you can access a lot of the free materials that I make available. On this slide, you'll see a URL for Literacy Lines. That's a blog that I write every month. I take a topic related to literacy, I explore it, and provide all kinds of links and background information. I've already mentioned the free resources section of my Keys to Literacy website, where you can access some of these materials that we've talked about in this workshop. I've also listed for you the different professional development programs that I've authored and for which we provide training. And then finally, if you follow social media, please follow me at Twitter and also at Facebook, and the connection for that is at Keys to Literacy. Thank you very much, and good luck with your literacy planning.